Hey guys, it's the Comics Kid 2099 and I am here for another review of an episode of the series Medabots. It has been a long time since I reviewed the first episode, and the only thing I can say is I am sorry it has been so long. Just content on this channel on the whole has slowed down quite a bit, and the biggest reason for that is for about a week I was sick near the end of last semester. And also, for about a month now, I have been trying to read at least one graphic novel per day, and so that has slowed me down on things like watching animated series like Medabots or Batman the Animated Series. And also just making videos in general has slowed down because of that. So I just wanted to give an explanation for why it's been so long since my review of the previous episode, and I hope to do these reviews with a little bit more of a regular schedule from now on. I don't think I've ever seen an installment of an ongoing story in any media that was as much of a piece of filler as the second episode of Medabots, titled Return of the Screws. I don't have a problem with standalone episodes in television, as long as it offers something other than evolution of the ongoing story. It might be comedy if I'm watching a sitcom, or it might be engaging characters or high concepts if I'm watching something in the way of science fiction or fantasy. This episode, unfortunately, doesn't offer anything like that. I find the characters even less engaging and interesting than they were in the previous episode, and there was only one instance where I actually laughed in the span of 22 minutes. When both of those failed, this episode did nothing in building the ongoing story that I assume this series will be getting around to as it keeps going. After the events of the first episode, where Icky, the protagonist, defeated a gang of bullies, he is now seen as a hero around the school, and a potential threat by a different gang of bullies who we saw in the previous episode. Most of this episode is devoted to what we already found out at the end of the first episode. We found out that Medabots is disobedient to his metafighter, Icky, unlike every other robot in this world. I really did not need an entire episode devoted to Icky finding out that Medabots won't listen to him. It would have been different if the episode ended with Medabots and Icky coming to an understanding about how they are going to work together from now on, and the episode almost ended on that note. But then Medabots finds out that Icky only used him for his own personal gain, and then we're back to Medabots attacking Icky, which I guess is supposed to be funny. The episode comes very close to developing two of the main characters and their relationship with each other, but then they take a step backwards and keep that relationship at exactly the same place that it was at the end of the previous episode. I mentioned that the characters are less engaging in this episode than in the first episode. What I mean by this is that Icky, while annoying at times, in the first episode he came off as somewhat sympathetic, as he is something of an outsider, and he can't play in all the reindeer games with everyone else. But in this episode, I have zero sympathy for him, and in several cases, I feel like he is just straight up unlikable. It seems pretty obvious to me that Medabots would listen to Icky if Icky asked him nicely to do things. Icky's mom asks Medabots to take out the garbage. Medabots complies. It doesn't take a genius, or even a very smart 11-year-old, to figure out that asking nicely could get Icky much further than acting like he is the lord and master of everything. The other character I came to distinctly dislike was Erika, the girl who works for the school newspaper. In my review for the previous episode, I mentioned that the school newspaper seemed like a gimmick to get the characters more involved in the story. But here, while her report on the events that took place in the previous episode is crucial in propelling the plot of this episode, she is just a straight-up unlikable character. When Medabots is yelling at Icky for using him for his own personal gain, Erika shows Medabots a photograph that implicates Icky in doing just what Medabots said. I guess this is supposed to be funny, but I see no reason why Erika would do this, as it doesn't get her a good story. She is just tattling on her friend for no reason other than she's an unlikable character. There are two things that are introduced in this episode that could potentially be important for the ongoing series arc later on. The first is the guy who sold Icky the Medabots body is very interested in the metal, or the robot brain, that powers Medabots. We know nothing about this metal other than that it was stolen from someone, and then stolen from that group of thieves, and then misplaced by that thief and dropped in the water. We still don't know who any of those characters are, or what they wanted with this particular medal. I was really looking forward to finding out more about these characters, but it seems that will have to wait for another episode. It did occur to me that the guy who sold Medabots to Ikki might be the thief who stole the medal from the group of thieves in the previous episode. He reacted very oddly when Ikki told him that he found the medal in the river where that thief dropped it. There is no reason the location of this medal should surprise the retailer unless he is the thief who dropped it in the water or he works with the thief. The other piece of new information is that the school bullies who are antagonists of this episode are actually working for a crime lord called Baron von Banish. This is treated as a big deal, and we are clearly meant to think that this guy is the equivalent of Giovanni from Team Rocket, if we're continuing my comparison of Medabots to Pokemon from my review of the previous episode. But while Giovanni is actually intimidating and is a threat, this guy is literally defeated in 4 seconds or less. I was actually distracted during the fight, missed the whole thing, and had to rewind to see what I missed. A quick glance online tells me that this Baron does not make any further appearances in the series. This just tells me that the people behind this show already knew that this episode was skippable, and they were trying to find ways to fill it out to make sure that the audiences thought that it was important when it really wasn't. In retrospect, I think my review of the first episode of Medabots might have been too positive. I had been looking at this series as a response to my less than positive review of Cubics. I certainly maintain that Medabots is better than Cubics, but after a few months away from watching the pilot episode of Cubics, I find that Medabots has its fair share of problems that might make watching this series less enjoyable than I first thought. That's just something to keep in mind as I keep going with this series. Unless future episodes really get their act together, I may drop this series. Not as fast as I dropped Cubics, but certainly faster than I would have thought after watching the first episode. As far as my thoughts on this episode, if you're curious what this series is about, I would not recommend watching this episode. I can easily see this episode driving someone away if it was their first exposure to the world of Medabots. Then again, I don't really think I'm the target audience for this show that ended a decade ago. Maybe this episode lured in the target audience like candy to a hungry bear when it aired, but for me, this episode just does not cut the mustard.